Hello, Lake, Wisconsin Church. It is Wednesday, March 25th. It has been about 10 days that many of us have been self sheltering and spread out from each other. So we're producing a devotional each day so that it can kind of remind us that our brothers and sisters in our church family are thinking through some of the same scriptures and just interacting with God and maybe some of the same ways we are. We hope that this kind of diminishes the separation and reminds you that even though our church family isn't physically present together, we're still one group and we're still kind of coming before God and um, ministering to each other in all the ways that are possible. Our devotional today is about suffering and about how God often does things, good things in our suffering. I wore my Bears hat because I need to remind you guys that as a Bears fan, I have a long history of suffering. For example, you guys like to make fun of Bears fans for having Jay Cutler as our quarterback, and what you don't even realize is he's the best quarterback we've ever had. And so, the guy that you make fun of for us as a terrible quarterback is actually the best we've ever had. And so, that's just a quick example of a little bit of suffering. But these last 10 days, maybe the last 2, 3 weeks, maybe the 2 weeks, 3 weeks ahead, we're going to be suffering in some ways that are far more significant than just teasing and football. Maybe you guys have family members that are suffering from this virus. Maybe you're just looking at your life savings and your investments are just plummeting. Maybe you have a student at home who's not going to go to prom, not going to get to play spring sports, and you're just kind of mourning some of those things that they're going through. The list goes on and on. Everybody, in some way, shape, or form, is suffering as a result of this unprecedented virus that the whole world is undergoing right now. But Scripture gives us comfort, and Scripture reminds us that God works through suffering. So I'm going to go through this really quick. I want to kind of keep this shorter than maybe the last couple. Our story today starts in Genesis 15. Now, in Genesis 15, there's this guy, Abram. God will go on to change his name to Abraham. And God kind of shifts the way that he works with people at this point in Genesis 15. And instead of kind of working through all the nations, he says he's going to pick one person and he's going to bless them and their descendants. That person is Abram, and the descendants are then who go on to become the Hebrew people. And so here in Genesis 15, God is addressing what he's going to do through Abram and his descendants. And he says in Genesis 15:12-16 this, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a strange land, a land that is not theirs, and they will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge afterwards. They shall come out with great possessions. And so that had to have been a strange encounter for Abram. God says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless your descendants. But then the very next part of that blessing is you're going to be oppressed. You're going to be slaves in a foreign land for 400 years, and you're going to suffer. Well, of course, that's not the whole story. If you're reading along here, make a note to read Exodus 1:11, and that just tells us some of the horrible ways that the Israelites suffered. They had to work rigorously. Their overseers were taskmasters, and it just talks about all the suffering that God's people were undergoing as a part of that promise or that blessing that was given to Abram. But what I really want to focus on right now, and what I think can be a huge encouragement to all of us, comes in Exodus 12, 40-41. And listen to this detail that's given as God is finally taking his people out of bondage. And it says this in Exodus 12, 40-41. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years, and it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So Just a quick recap here in this story. God blesses this guy Abram and his descendants, but that blessing involves 400 years of suffering for Abram and his ancestors. So we finally get to this part in Exodus 12 where God answers their prayers and delivers them. And it tells us that it was exactly the amount of days, the very day that God had said that suffering would expire. So let me wrap up with this. This is kind of where I've been trying to build to quickly for the sake of a shorter devotion. I think there's three things that we can learn about God and what he does through suffering, just from this small account all the way from the beginning of the Old Testament. First thing we learn from this story is that God uses suffering and discomfort to form his people. Now, that might not sound like good news, but here in this world we do suffer. And as we suffer, isn't it good news to know that God is working through it? You know, maybe you can't be going to work, maybe you can't be watching your favorite baseball team, because of this virus, there's a lot of things that we can't do. There's a lot of things that are just on hold. There's a lot of things that we just look forward to resuming again. But even though we're not meeting together in a church building, God's work in our lives is not on hold. God works through all things, and He's working through this suffering and He's working through this discomfort that we're all enduring right now. Is that good news? God is at work, even in this odd thing that we're going through together. Another thing that I think can be encouraging from today's verses is that it tells us we can infer that God doesn't relish his children's suffering. You know, sometimes if one of my kids is getting a timeout or something like that, and they've been talking back and they're just kind of crying a little bit extra loud just to remind everybody the injustice that they've incurred. You know, maybe I said go sit on the stairs for 2 minutes and they're being super obnoxious, and so I let that 2 minutes stretch into 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And sometimes you just enjoy that extra time of peace and quiet or whatever it is, but that's not how it is with God. And this story tells us that the very day that time expired, God brought his people out of suffering. We can infer something from that as well, and we can infer that God knows when this quarantine is going to end. God knows when this threat of the pandemic and the virus is going to be over. God knows the exact day, and the exact day that God has intended for that to happen, He's going to lead us out of that. God won't forget about us. He's not making us suffer for no reason, and He knows the very moment that this is going to end, and we can look forward to it knowing that it's something that God anticipates and looks forward to as well. The final thing that I want to wrap up, some encouragement that we can take from this story as we learn what God does through suffering is this. You guys remember all the way back in that first passage when part of the blessing that God gave to Abram was that his descendants would come out of that suffering and that oppression with great possessions. It says that in Genesis 15:14. It also tells us in Exodus 12:36 that as the Israelites were scurrying to leave from Egypt, the Egyptians, the former slave masters, were like so afraid from the 10 plagues that they were giving gold and silver and big purple rugs and curtains to the Israelites. And it's kind of a funny detail because if I was going into the wilderness, I would like want some water and some bread and a blanket. I wouldn't necessarily want all those luxurious items, but that's how the story unfolds. And then when we get to Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, we learn that God took those resources, God took those commodities, and He had Israel's most skilled craftsmen fashion those into the tabernacle, the beautiful place where God's presence could be enjoyed by His people. In other words, all the way back from the original promise, the original blessing, God knew that through the suffering, the Israelites would emerge from Egypt with that gold and silver and fabric, which would then be used to make the tabernacle, where God's people would just have a beautiful encounter with Him. The third source of encouragement that we can take from today's scripture is that God will work through our suffering to give us a more personal and beautiful encounter with Him. That's something that we can look forward to. That's something that we see in Scripture many times, especially in this story. Guys, I hope you're encouraged. I read the news and I'm discouraged. Look out the window, I can be discouraged. When I open up Scripture, God speaks to me and He gives me hope and He reminds me that He's at work, even in our suffering. The days of our suffering are numbered in His sovereign calendar, and we're going to emerge through all of this with a greater encounter with God. I hope these things encourage you like they encourage me.